All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast of around 12 years of ethnographic research into autistic Christians and ex Christians, mostly in their online communities, and focusing on ASD1. This is a podcast where we like to talk about autism and Christianity, autism and leaving Christianity, sometimes just Christianity, and sometimes more philosophical topics in the realm of autism. And this episode is going to be more of the latter category. In I I like to patrol Substack for new Substack publications where people are posting good stuff. And one of my favorite ones, it's pretty up and coming, is my podcast guest today. He wrote a really good article about identity, and I have been wanting to talk about this topic on the podcast for a very long time because it is so intimately tied with autism and everything in the realm of autism that we talk about. And so I asked him if he wanted to come on the podcast to talk about this, and he does. So without further ado, Simon, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks. Yeah, it was exciting when I got that invitation because I'm a small fish on Substack. I think I've got double-digit subscribers, but I appreciate that you read the thing I wrote. Yeah, I go by Simon. Yeah, my handle was like Simple Simon, and now it's Simple, and that's the name of my Substack. And I use a pseudonym, as I was explaining to you before we started rolling, partly because my day job involves being a therapist, and I also sort of work in academia. I'm getting a PhD in clinical psychology, and so I have a research interest in identity and in diagnostic labels, but also I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic Christian, and a theology nerd and a philosophy nerd, and I have an interest in the way all of those things intersect. So on my Substack, I write about sort of things related to philosophy, psychology, and religion.
Yeah, you also had a really interesting post that I know got a lot of interest in my Discord, or at least sparked a lot of discussion about the experiences or emotional ecstatic experiences of Christianity or lack thereof,
Yeah.
that I thought were really good. And yeah, maybe we'll have you on to talk about that as well in a different episode
Cool.
if
Yeah.
that's what you're interested
I
in.
didn't prep for
Because
that. I'm happy to talk. That's in some ways easier to talk about because it's all so sort of autobiographical. But yeah, yeah.
yeah, well, I have just this is like the emotional ecstatic experiences of religion in autistic people is something that I'm very interested in because most of us don't have it.
Yeah, can I ask you, John? Do you? I mean, say as much
Yeah,
or as
go
little
for
as
it.
you're comfortable saying. But have you? So I wrote this thing called like Confessions of a Mystical Experience Non-Haver, and have you ever had a mystical experience?
Here is the difficulty with this. So the technical correct answer is yes. The actual experiential phenomenological answer is no.
Huh.
So the way I describe this is I have had an experience which, if I had in the Middle Ages, I would be like, I'm going to become a monk, or like, I'm going to dedicate my life to the church, in the sense that it felt very real and very significant. I think it has far more to do with like stress-based hallucinatory experiences
Mm.
from, a combination of military service and doing digital forensics on sexual assault cases for
Oh my
for a
gosh.
long time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then is sort of like just compacting traumatic experience, um, all sort of bundled up together. Plus, it was during the pandemic, right after I released from the military, and there were a whole bunch of things coming together, and I had like a weird stretch of semi hallucinatory experiences. It's very hard to physiologically, or sorry, it's hard to like describe what exactly was happening, but they were experience was where I was like, if I had not experienced this, in my current context with what I know now, in the way that I understand things, I think I would have thought I had been visited by God, who was
Yeah.
convicting me of my sins and, you
Oh,
know, bringing me a call to reform. I don't see it that way though. Right now, like if you ask me, like, have you had a spiritual experience? I'd say no, because to me that wasn't a spiritual experience. To me, that was like, oh, I had a really weird stress-based hallucination. In the same way that, like, on military exercises, when you're like 36 hours in and you haven't slept and you're manning the machine gun at 2 a.m. in a trench, and all of a sudden the bushes start moving and the bushes start speaking to you.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah, so I
you
haven't,
don't.
I don't have military
Yeah,
service in my background, but anytime there's sleep deprivation and like physical exhaustion and stress, you're liable to experience something like
yeah,
that. And this is a criticism, by the way, of like Christian like summer camps where you have
yeah,
this like life-changing experience, and you're like sleep deprived and you're in a new setting, and like you're more liable and more like suggestible, more susceptible to something that you might interpret as a mystical experience.
yeah. And so in, like, I don't consider the sleep deprivation 2 a.m. like machine gun
Yeah.
manning
Yeah.
experiences spiritual, right? I go like, oh, my brain's bugging out because I have done nothing but like hike over the cursed plains of Nova Scotia, and now I'm freezing to death in a trench, having not slept in 36 hours.
Crazy.
Of course,
Wow.
my brain is going to start like doing
Wow.
weird things to me, and so, you know, I had one of those types of experiences, but it was religiously flavored. So, like, is that actually a mystical experience? I personally don't interpret it as that. But had I not been in the frame of reference that I am now, I might have interpreted it like that. And like, I've talked to other religious people and they're like, "Oh, that's definitely a sign." And it's like, "Well, how do you know?" Like,
Yeah, so
how,
you
how
and I seem to share this then. You have a little bit of the kind of Reddit skeptic
yes.
fedora
Oh, hell
hat
yeah.
sort of
Yes.
demon within you, that
Yes.
you're
Oh,
willing to find naturalistic secondary causal explanations rather than jump straight to God talked to me.
yeah. The Reddit atheist is very much alive and well inside of me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's also interesting how you talk about like the summer camp experience, because I have never had that. I have never had any sort of group based religious experience, and there's something I call the universal autistic experience, because, or the universal autistic experience of Christianity, just because it's so common, where you go to cry night at Bible camp, or you go to like a worship service and the air feels heavy, people are like crying, everyone's like, I can feel God in this house tonight, and you're standing there, what the hell is everyone smoking?
Oh
uh
man, John, I need to
that,
worship with
yeah,
autistic people. That's what
you do.
that's the key. That's
Yes,
how I overcome
yeah,
this feeling of inadequacy that I have. All of my
yeah,
neurotypical friends have had at least one, incredible mystical experience. But meanwhile, all these autistic people are like, yeah, I feel nothing.
yeah, no, and it's like, what does it mean that I feel nothing in terms of religious experience? Like, why? Like, what? I do not hear God's voice. I do not feel his call. I am out at sea wandering in darkness,
Yeah.
while others seem to have a lighthouse that they are rowing towards, or have perhaps had a fisherman come by and find them, yet you are sort of like floating alone in a sea of darkness, and you hear nothing, you feel nothing, and you see nothing. Like, in terms of when you start bringing in, like, especially Calvinist soteriology, like with
Oh,
double
yeah.
predestination, where it's like, oh, I think this is a sign that I am not chosen by God.
Yeah, you're reprobate. Yeah, you don't have the
Yeah,
marks. You don't have the marks of salvation. Yeah, the sign.
exactly. Like, this is a sign of reprobation. I have an essay which I have not published yet because I think it still needs a lot a lot of work called Wandering in Darkness, where I
Good.
talk about
Good.
this and like the spiritual experience of nothingness, and even the spiritual experience of nothingness, or like the null spiritual experience in the presence of having had an experience that I know to other people would have been considered mystical, and yet still like my brain cannot accept that this is what it is. It's still this like hyper skeptical, hypercritical thing that would rather categorize my experiences into sort of discrete boxes of
Yeah.
phenomenological, psychological
Yeah.
experience
The
rather than
next
sort of a
iteration of the ADOS will have a question about this.
yeah.
When you have mystical experiences, do you feel
Yeah,
ecstasy, bliss, or nothing at all?
yeah,
Okay, nothing at all.
exactly,
Got it. All
exactly.
right.
Hell yeah. Like, sort of unironically, it probably should, because of the people I've surveyed,
Stop trying to
85%.
diagnose me, John. I've been on this for 11 minutes, and what are
But
you
like,
saying?
of those people, of all of the autistic people that I've talked to, 85% of them report feeling nothing.
Yeah, that's great.
And just like fundamentally confused at what questions, like, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus means?
Yeah.
Or most of us report really struggling with verbal spontaneous prayer, like talking to God as though God is there or a person that you can talk to or interact with. And there's a lot of
You're part of
interesting
like a high
stuff.
church tradition, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And most autistic people end up there.
Right. I was gonna say
Most
that's
of
the
us,
benefit of like having like a
exactly.
liturgy of the hours or an office that you pray. You don't need a colloquy. You don't need to like make up your own
Yes,
conversational words.
exactly.
You just pray the prayers that are written.
It is one of the reasons why I think autistic people, just as you age, the percentage likelihood that you will be in a high church significantly increases past the age of 22. So basically, once you get out of that college age, the chance every year, the chance that you will eventually be in a high church denomination goes up each year,
Yeah.
which is kind of fun. But yeah, anyway,
Okay.
we
So
need to
that
have
was
a
a
different
total tangent.
episode where we
Yeah.
talk about that, because I find this fascinating, and you seem like a good person to have that discussion with.
Well, let's
But
talk about identity. Let's talk about
identity,
identity.
yeah, that's what we're here for. So I guess the first question is like, what do you mean when you say the term identity?
Okay. Okay. So I'll set this up. This is how I tend to set it up when I explain this to
Go
people.
for it.
So has identity has a history as a philosophical term, and only in the 20th century, only in fact like midway through the 20th century, does it take on the psychological connotations that most people today associate with the term. So the philosophical meaning, I don't know how much, I assume you've read a little bit of philosophy because you like to read, and you know
Yes.
about
Yeah.
all kinds of things. So you know about like the ship of Theseus problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what philosophers have meant by identity, is like, how do you explain something's self sameness over time? How do you explain this kind of continuity whereby a thing at time A is the same thing as it is at time B and C and D? That's identity, or identity over time. Then you can also ask, in addition to questions of diachronic identity, you can ask about synchronic identity, like how is a thing the same, equal to itself, even in a single moment of time. And there's all kinds of philosophical puzzles. And this is the kind of stuff that contemporary analytic philosophers say, actually, there are no answers to these questions. And maybe there are no stable identities. But the psychological meaning of identity kind of shows up in the 20th century. Um, if any of your listeners studied psychology or early childhood education or something, they might remember the name Erik Erikson. He was a developmental theorist. People usually have to memorize the Piaget stages of development, and then there's like the Erikson stages of development. And the difference is that like the Erikson ones, no one can remember because there are too many of them. But one of those is in adolescence. Erik Erikson, this kind of psychoanalytically trained developmental theorist, said in adolescence, you have to resolve this conflict between identity and role confusion. And so for the first time, I have like a line in my article that says the term identity crisis is about as old as color TV. And that's true. For the first time in the 1950s, people started to talk about having identity crises, like, who am I? Like, what am I supposed to do? Kind of which aspects of myself are most important and most salient? And like, how do other people understand me? And how do I fit in into various social groups? And so that kind of identity, like the psychological kind of identity, most people just define as some kind of self definition or aspect of self concept. So, how you understand yourself, like your traits and your characteristics, and your social affiliations, and aspects of your history, and your beliefs, and your talents, and all the kind of things that make up who you are, how you sort of understand them, and how they make you intelligible to yourself and to others. I don't know if that is helpful at all. I'm happy to clarify.
Yeah, no, I think that is helpful. And to sort of tie this back to what we tangented on at the beginning, I think it might be helpful to get into the sort of how do we even get here? So when we talk about these like experiences of personal relationship with Jesus or this
Yeah.
emotional connection to the divine or this phenomenological experience of religion or this experience of the presence of God, a lot of our Christian ideas of that have less to do with historic Christianity, but more to do with the particular brainworms of American Calvinists during the Great Revival.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so we think about these phenomenological emotional experiences of religion and go like, well, obviously this was always how Christians thought about their experiences. And like, sure, you could probably find Christians throughout all of Christian history who at some point talked about something that you could probably approximate to that. But this was by no means the dominant mode through which you interpreted your religious experience until this sort of point in history. And then after this point in history, it sort of sticks and it starts getting iterated on. And now here it is in the air we breathe, and we sort of don't recognize the history for the same reason a fish doesn't recognize that it's swimming in water. It's sort of just everywhere and it's in everything you breathe. And so this concept of identity, you said it came around like, you know, in the 1950s. Where does that come from?
Yeah. So I love this kind of thing. I love like intellectual histories or like conceptual histories or historiography. So there's a book I'll plug, and everything I like mention, every if I mention a book or an academic paper or a researcher, I'll email you or DM you the names and the links. So there's a book called Identity, the Necessity of a Modern Idea by a historian named Gerald Eisenberg. And I was like, when I read this, first of all, this is the kind of book where if you're into this sort of thing, this is like a great read. If you like those, 800-page like Charles Taylor books, like A Secular Age, you're
Oh,
gonna
hell yeah.
love Gerald Eisenberg. It's that kind of book. It's like a history of an idea. And I'd recommended this book to a bunch of friends, one of whom, this online friend who has a much bigger and more successful Substack than me, my buddy La Vita Lenta, who writes a lot about like leisure. He wrote a really nice, so he read this book at my behest and he wrote a really nice summary of it. And then I read his summary and I thought, oh, I have more to say about identity. So that's the genesis of my article. Now, the genesis of the term and its use, Christianity actually plays a role, I think. So there's a kind of long history and there's a kind of short history. I'm not a historian by training, so all of the stuff I'm telling you is just from what I've read. So I just want your audience to know, when I talk about like psychology research, I can speak with an air of authority. When I talk about history, I'm just sort of talking about sort of my fun intellectual side interests. But the sort of basic idea is that in pre-modernity, a lot of these things were just given to you by society. People sort of had a place in this larger cosmic order, and they didn't need to ask the kinds of questions that like American teenagers today have to ask. You didn't have to like find yourself. A lot of the sort of roadmap of your life, if it wasn't just given to you, like it would be in like a society with a caste system, for example, or a society where you were expected to sort of inherit the family trade. If it wasn't given to you, then at the very least, it was easier to discover, because there were fewer options on offer. Now, one of the ways Christianity begins to shake that up is by even introducing the notion of a vocation. The early Christians, unlike their pagan counterparts, had, to a certain extent, had the freedom to extricate themselves from the pre-established order into which they were born and choose a different way of life, like a going the route of like radical desert monasticism instead of working as the as a whatever, the blacksmith or something, fisherman. Also, in part because Christianity involves, yeah, I mean, it would be anachronistic to say, from the very beginning you have this personal relationship with Jesus language, but from the very beginning you have this sense that you have to answer kind of the fundamental questions, and that other people can't quite answer those for you. And so some Christian writers on identity have located its long antecedents in Christian antiquity. And then with Augustine, you sort of have this idea that one of the ways we encounter God is through a turn inward, like through some kind of introspection, because he's closer to us than we are even to ourselves. Some people will say Augustine invents or discovers the self. I think that's a little strong, but nevertheless, it's a sort of gradual process that culminates in the sort of radical displacement from the pre-established cosmic harmony that you get in the 20th century, right? So in the 20th century, sort of modernity comes to a head. You have a world war, you have the Industrial Revolution, and it doesn't seem like any of the kind of old answers are satisfactory. And so they don't hold up to the scrutiny of like the chaos of modernity. And so it's during this interwar period, Gerald Eisenberg notices, during this interwar period where you have, even before the term identity comes into currency, you have novelists writing stories about characters that like don't have an identity and are searching for themselves, and they have to either create it or they have to accept the absurd nihilistic fate that there isn't any identity they can really find because there's no way we can actually make sense of ourselves. So you have like Musil's Man Without Qualities, and Pirandello's Six Characters in Search of Their Author, and Virginia Woolf, and all these kind of stream of consciousness writers that are in one way or another getting at this idea that we can't just rest on our laurels and like be sort of complacent to accept that like, oh yeah, each of us has a part to play in sort of the big sort of cosmic story that God is writing. That doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. That brings up so many things that just are jogging up in my mind. One of the things that I found striking about reading a lot of things from antiquity, as I sometimes do, is a overbearing presence of things like fate in deciding your future, and the fates as in there was preordained a path for you, sort of, it'd be anachronistic to say in like a Calvinistic way, but in a way where it's like there is a path for you, and it is, you are going on a journey to discover your path. And then also, very reminiscent of what you were saying, have you read Peter Brown's The Body and Society?
Oh yeah, I've like picked away at it, but that's
Okay.
another book of this kind, and yeah, I hear
Yeah.
it's like excellent. I need to finish it. Yeah.
Yeah, but he talks a lot about virginity and the sort of idea of chastity as being one of these first sort of formative ways for you to break from society and to make your own path, especially for women. And one of the reasons that women were drawn to Christianity was, before it was like, you are a mother or you are a in some other station. But with this other path, it was like, well, you now have this whole world open to you where you are no longer under this particular patriarchal umbrella and are under a different umbrella. You are under God's umbrella, and that changes your orientation to society. And so, yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of validity to the idea that a lot of notions of identity are tied quite closely to Christianity. So I guess you could blame us for this mess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. At least kind
So
of in the sort of remote causes, Christianity is to blame. That I think
yeah,
it's important before we go any further for me to just say I'm not entirely unsympathetic or critical of this concept. I have a sort of a nuanced and qualified criticism of it, and I'm familiar with the ways that identity and our struggle and obsession with identity in our sort of contemporary era can cause psychological suffering. But I tend to agree with Gerald Eisenberg. So the sort of TLDR takeaway from this very long book. How long is it? This book is, it's not quite a Charles Taylor book. This is just about 500 or so pages. The takeaway from this 500-page book is that for us, modern or postmodern people, identity is both impossible and necessary. It's philosophically impossible and it's psychologically necessary. And the reason it's necessary is precisely because we've gotten rid of this old order. We don't live in an enchanted cosmos. We live in a cosmos that, first of all, your point about preordained determinism is a point well taken, because I think this is absolutely true, that as far as I can tell, like, ancient pagan philosophers didn't know about contingency. Contingency doesn't show up. Everything was deterministic and everything was necessary. And in some ways, the sort of development of Christian philosophy is, among other things, the working out of this idea that God freely created the world and that it could have been otherwise. And at
yeah,
least in the Christian tradition to which I belong, we would also say God creates human persons with free will. So there's
yeah,
a ton of contingency in the universe that you and I, in this very moment, can choose to do other than we're doing, and that God can choose to do other than He's doing. So all that to say that we can sort of meet a guy like Jean-Paul Sartre halfway and agree that there is this radical freedom, and that not a lot is sort of given or preordained. Um, and we have to figure out what to do with that. And identity, in the psychological sense, is one answer to that existential problem. The existential problem of, like, I don't know what to do given the fact that I have this freedom in a sort of empty, uh, what some people call this liquid modernity, this world that lacks solidity and pre-given answers. I have to find them myself. And so, yeah, identity is a very understandable tool that people would use to try and make sense of a world that doesn't come to us prepackaged with meaning.
yeah. So I haven't read this book, so I'm mostly just curious about what it says about this, or if there is anything to it. But another thing about the rise in identity is it also seems somewhat correlated with the rise of psychiatric medicine in general, and psychiatry and psychology in general. Like the autism diagnosis is about as old as identity itself, right? So are these things at all linked?
Yeah, Eisenberg doesn't talk about that, but other people do, and this is a huge interest of mine. So great, this is a nice segue. You've set me up. You've set me up
Hell
very
yeah.
nicely. Yeah. Okay. So any way that we define ourselves can sort of count as an identity, right? So if you're a parent or a Christian or an immigrant, or you're tall or you're short or you're good at sports, or whatever, you're a fan of this or that team. We have a lot of sort of identity opportunities in our kind of contemporary cultural milieu. And among those are like mental health terms, like psychiatric diagnostic labels. There's a really cool article in the New Yorker like 2 years ago called I can't, this is from memory, something like "We're Turning Psychiatric Diagnoses into Identities" by an anthropologist, Manveer Singh, I think, Singh. And I'm often surprised by how few people have like written on this. So he's one. This isn't like his area, but he wrote this for the New Yorker, and I thought it was excellent. Why we're turning psychiatric labels into identities. And here's the sort of subtitle header. So you're on the spectrum, or you've got borderline personality disorder, or you're a sociopath. Once you're sure that's who you are, you've got a personal stake in a very creaky diagnostic system. End quote. So yeah, one of the ways that we make sense of ourselves is through diagnostic terminology, right? And this is, and but incidentally, this is a really common answer to like the referral question. Like when if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist and someone comes in and they say I would like testing an assessment for ADHD or for autism or for, BPD, and you ask them why, very often people will say, I'd like to understand myself. I want to know why I am the way I am. And so this is a kind of putative causal explanation, or like a putative account of like who you are and why you are the way you are, which is exactly what identity is designed to do or to offer.
Yeah, and I think this is where things get very complicated, right? Because one of the things that I've been talking about on this podcast for a few months now is like, what even is autism, right? It is a label for a collection of externally observed traits. Fundamentally, that's what it is. That's what most psychiatric diagnoses are, right? There are some where we have like observed biomarkers, right, where we have precise, okay, you have this because of this mutation on your X chromosome.
Arguably we don't. Arguably we don't.
Yeah, even then, even if you have a biomarker for it, it's like, still, what is that biomarker? Why is that biomarker the thing that is giving you this particular label? And at the end of the day, what it comes down to is we've decided that these are helpful clusters of traits because people who tend to have these clusters of traits, interventions for those people tend to fall along certain lines and tend to be more successful than others. Fundamentally, that's what these labels are, right? They're collections and clusters of traits. And where we draw those lines and how we draw those lines, how we group things, how we cluster things, and how do you differentiate between autism and complex trauma, because it can often look the same, and usually the answer is something like, well, you look at childhood history, and the question is like, well, why do we care about your childhood history? Like, fundamentally, why is that something we're interested in? And at the end of the day, it's like, well, we sort of just use these labels out of pragmatic necessity, because at some point you have to do something. And typically these labels are given to you if there is a disorder, like you are dysfunctional across multiple contexts and it's causing distress and other issues like that. However, we're also getting to a point now where a lot of people, especially autistic people, will deny the dysfunction part and will deny the distress part. And it's like, okay, well, what does this grouping of symptoms even mean at that point? Like, and we'll say things like the autistic brain, but there really isn't an autistic brain out there, right? Like, if there was, we would have found it by now. We've done a lot of neurology studies. Right. Like, we have done many fMRI imaging things. I mean, those even are more philosophically complicated than a lot of people like to lead them on to be. And there are a lot of questions about, like, well, what are you actually looking at when you're looking at an fMRI? But like, we say, well, autistic people have a brain or a neurotype, and it's like, well, sure, but what is that neurotype? And how does that actually map onto the label? Is there actually, if we do have like a neurological phenotype that you can find on a biological level, does everyone who has the autism label have that phenotype? Or are there different complications in there? Right. And why are we even using these labels? Is, there are all these sorts of questions. And this gets to sort of, why do we even care about psychiatric labels or psychological labels? Like, what is the relevance there?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I have Yeah, just like you, I feel like we're both experiencing this. I have like too many thoughts about this, so I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I'll tell you what. I could easily get baited into an entire kind of discussion of like psychiatric nosology and the like ontological status of psychiatric disorders. I find that really interesting. I
Hell
will
yeah.
try to like temper my enthusiasm for that because I want to talk about identity and like the way
Another
specific
episode.
labels are helpful. So I'll just say a little bit about psychiatric diagnoses because you said too many tantalizing things for me not to. I teach abnormal psychology to undergraduates, and this is my favorite. My favorite part of the semester is the first part because the first part of the semester we get to ask like the big questions, like what is mental illness? Is there mental illness? What does it mean? Who gets to decide what is a mental disorder and what's not a mental disorder? And then like the rest of the year is mostly like you have to kind of memorize the sort of key features of different kind of categories of mental disorder as sort of specified by the diagnostic and statistical manual, the Bible of psychiatry. So that's less fun. We talk about other kind of fun things too, like treatment and controversy. But when we're covering the big sort of conceptual questions at the start, I make exactly this distinction between like a disease and a syndrome. And according to some sort of well accepted definitions of disease in medicine, for something to be a disease, you need to understand its underlying pathophysiological process. And that's exactly what we lack for virtually everything in DSM. You mentioned biomarkers, some with the possible exception of narcolepsy, which isn't really even like sort of a sort of a characteristically, emblematic mental disorder. Everything else lacks biomarkers, and we lack, or at least diagnostic biomarkers, in the kind of sense that like when you to get COVID you get a nasal swab or something, or for cancer you get a biopsy. We don't have that for like major depressive disorder. So syndromes, rather than being diseases, syndromes are just like signs and symptoms that run together. That's kind of in the etymology of the term syndrome. So you're right. Yeah, with autism, there's like, you need all three from criterion A, and 2 out of 4 from criterion B. And you mentioned that they're grouped together for pragmatic purposes. I might challenge that a little bit. I'm not like a Shazian or anything, but I am a DSM critic. And one of the issues with the DSM, as far as I can tell, is that it doesn't actually offer you a ton of clinical utility. One of the reasons for that is there are like so many different combinations of these signs and symptoms that you actually have people who look completely different that have the same diagnostic label. So I'm curious, John, have you ever looked at the DSM criteria and done the math? Like how many different ways a person can have autism?
Oh, yeah, the answer is 16. No, I'm joking. When I say for pragmatic reasons,
Yeah.
what I'm talking about is insurance coding
Oh, yeah, that's
and
right.
and
Yeah.
and things like special ed funding. And the reason that we have this label is so that we can slap a number on it and say, okay, you have this problem. We are going to allocate X number of resources to you for this problem. Like fundamentally, the reason that we have it is so the organs of society that keep us moving, like insurance providers or
Right.
like a healthcare system, have the thing that they need to
Yeah,
do
yeah,
the next thing in the step, right? Like
that's right.
when I say pragmatic, I mean they function like a cog
I see. I
in the
see.
gears,
That's helpful.
not
That's helpful.
not as like I think they're really useful things for
Yeah,
treatment,
sure. Right. Right.
but more like they have practical effects in your everyday life. So like the reason we have an autism label is because people with autism have shitty lives,
Yeah, they
and,
need services often. Often.
and we need services, and we can't just give services to everyone, and we have to build triage queues. And so the way we build triage queues is we slap a label on you and go.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah, in my own research, like I see, like you could break it down millions of different ways, especially
Yeah,
if we start talking about like statistical mapping and statistical graphing.
exactly. Yeah.
So I have a system of clusters that I use to categorize the autistic Christians that I have in my data set and that I find. Roughly about 16 categories, but those
Mm,
categories themselves are like 30 different categories of things that are just like, honestly, they're just k-means clustered together. And this is sort of like, I have arbitrarily decided that I am going to use 254 different Ks in my k-means clustering set, like different center points in this data labeling set. And I have used this many arbitrary vectors. And
Yeah,
so,
that's great. I love that you're like a stats and math guy. That's great.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so it's just like the answer to that is like, I have interviewed at this point over 630 autistic Christians, and there are underlying patterns
Yeah.
in them, but there is very rarely a single through line that actually unites them, because people are just people are very different. I mean, one of the things I'm constantly saying on this podcast is autism, what we call autism, is a very heterogeneous condition. And what I mean by that is, it's very hard to say anything definitively about autistic people, because you go in the diagnostic criteria and you go to the DSM and you start listing, what do these things mean? How do they present in a person? And like, before DSM-5, we had DSM, and DSM-4 with respect to autism was arguably even more of a mess.
Yeah,
because
I was trained on 4TR. I'll sort of date myself a little bit. I'm not super young here, but I was trained on 4TR, and yeah, it was yeah. What do you think about the collapsing Asperger's into ASD?
I mean, I personally find it annoying, but I personally,
it happened in 2013, so we're not.
Yes,
yes. Get used to it, I guess.
It was, yeah. So I was one of the Asperger's cohorts.
Yeah,
and so like my personal feelings of it were, it makes sense for a lot of reasons in a lot of contexts, and like my answer to most questions is a very boring, well, it depends on what context you're asking me that question, right? Because in a lot of cases, I meet people who are basically clones of me who got diagnosed PDD-NOS.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why did you get PDD-NOS? Well, because I was very well spoken and I read a lot of books and I read a lot of literature. So by the time I was assessed at age 12, I had a really good grasp of figurative and literal language. And I was able to, I wasn't literally interpreting things, and I had a lot of time practicing turn taking because I was in debate. And so I got PDD-NOS, and it's like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's a super like arbitrary distinction. I've talked to some like clinicians who worked at the time, and one of them told me that if you got 600 people in a room and said, okay, 200 of these have Asperger's, 200 of these have PDD-NOS, and 200 of these have high functioning autism, you're not allowed to ask about their childhoods. Who has what? They're like, you might as well just guess.
Yeah.
Right? You might as well just start randomly assign people the numbers 1, 2, or 3, and then sort them into a bucket, and you would probably be about as successful in guessing their original diagnosis, because like at a certain point, once they're adults, it's sort of like you all converge along the same lines. And so from that perspective, I think it makes sense. But then there's other perspective of like, why are we taking a person such as myself, who can get a master's degree, who has a
podcast,
wife and kids.
Yeah.
Yes. Why are we labeling me with a person who has such a severe disability that they will basically never be able to do anything that we would ever expect of another human, right? Like we have these people who basically live lives where they need 24/7 care, 24/7 supervision. It's very hard. It's very difficult for them, for their families. And they are at like a level of difficulty that like I can't relate to them. I've spent a lot of time talking to them and their families, and I'm like, I'm just like, why are we in the same category? Because the whole like the question, was, was man made for the diagnostic label or the diagnostic label made for man. I think it's very much the diagnostic labels are made for us to facilitate
Yeah.
functioning through society as one of those cogs in a wheel. And I think a lot of the way that the autism diagnosis works is that it doesn't really work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's trying to be all things to all people, and it can't even be that. I'm currently writing a piece about, I don't know what the title will be by the time this comes out, but I've provisionally titled it N-logging Autism. It's like the
Awesome.
not like
Oh,
other
yeah.
girls, because it's sort of my reaction to reading like Unmasking Autism and a lot of the sort of new wave of neurodiversity literature, and realizing that I am not in this, right? Like my type of autism, the sort of socially aloof, intense nerd who makes frequent and social mistakes, isn't in there.
Uh,
And it's like it's a very weird feeling of, it's like, okay, am I being pushed out of my own psychiatric diagnosis right now by just the way that autism is being used by the community itself as a collective identity, where they will go and they will say like, well, autism isn't like these stereotypes, and the stereotypes they list are just plain descriptions of my own behavior. And so it's like,
that's rough.
so when we're talking about questions of identity, it's like, well, one of the reasons that I've been like more separating myself from a lot of autism first identity is, first of all, just like a general disillusionment with the movement, but also that the way that the term has changed over time, I feel no longer comes to represent me particularly. And that, so I have this whole like joke about high feelings autism and low feelings autism,
Yeah.
and how we need to split the spectrum between these two because they might as well be different things.
Well, it's a
And
joke, but it's not, because it would have
yeah,
pragmatic utility. No.
yes, exactly. Like it's sort of like a half joke. I don't think we're going to do that. I don't think there'd be a point in doing it. But like at a fundamental level, the reason why it's funny is because people read it and go like, okay, well, like that that's kind of
There's
true. Like
something there. Yeah.
there is a there
Every
in
good
that.
joke has that sort of kernel of truth. Yeah. No, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of pragmatic utility. So I'll say one more thing about this, because this is, I think, important. I think that's exactly right. I think the labels are made for us, right? And so what we want out of the labels is a way to help people live better lives and suffer less. I think that's what we all want. So if the label, qua label, helps you find the right treatment, then that's great. That the problem is the label qua label doesn't, because yeah, exactly. If I said, I have this person, I would like you to help, if I, whatever, trained you to be a therapist, and I'd like you to help this person. And all I'm going to tell you about them is their age. I'm going to give you some demographic features, and then I'll tell you they have an autism diagnosis. You would have no way to know how to help them. You would need to find out way more. So in DSM, there are like a few really fun papers that are like peer-reviewed articles where people have criticized the DSM's lack of clinical utility. One of them is called 636,120 Ways to Have Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, where the authors actually do this sort of combinatorial math on PTSD. Because of the number of specifiers and the number of combinations of symptoms in the different domains, you end up having just this huge heterogeneity. So too with autism. I couldn't find any papers to that effect, sort of criticizing the DSM's heterogeneity with respect to autism, but I punched in some back of the napkin math, and it looks like if you have 11 variations of core symptoms, 9 variations of severity levels, and then 32 ways you can have specifiers, it looks as though, John, there are 3,168 ways to have DSM-5 autism. So that kind of
yeah.
unhelpful.
So
Yeah.
so I'll sort of complicate this even more by say, just look at any of the particular features of autism that we talk about. So we talk about things like empathy deficits in autism. What are we saying when we say empathy deficits? So I have been going on my own journey here. Claude Code, just the love of my life. He allows me to pull down bulk collect papers and then synthesize and extract so
Nice.
much from
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Well,
So like
you can't be Catholic then, because we're not allowed to use AI.
exactly.
Our Pope said we can't.
Bishop of Rome hath no jurisdiction on my computer.
I figured.
You know,
Yeah.
39 articles or something like that. But so I basically just pulled papers that had autism and empathy in them and tried to see if I could pull out a definition of empathy from those papers, see like what have they said. And in the like 180 papers that I was able to find, there were like almost as many specific definitions of empathy that slightly differed from each other. But if you sort of synthesize those and boil them down, you get 30 distinctive definitions that are in some way mutually exclusive. So they might not be fully mutually exclusive, but they have one point where it's like, well, this can't be this and this at the same time. And in those 30 definitions, there are like 12 different themes that are going on there. And not only that, if you look at the measures that they've used for them, there are like 50 different ways that they measure them. And like, I'm not the only one who's done this. I looked at a bunch of systematic reviews, and like one of them found 43 discrete definitions and 8 themes. And it's like, we talk about like social deficits, and part of a social deficit is this like empathy deficit or cognitive empathy deficit, mostly in autism. And it's just like, what even is that? Right? And so you take your like computation of combinatorics, and then you add in, okay, well, in one of those combinations, there are potentially 30 different combinations in a sub combination that you now have to account for. And so, yeah, it gets to a point where it's just like, what the hell are we even talking about here?
And I love that because that's such a great illustration of how, although psychiatrists might not be interested in philosophy, philosophy is interested in them, and you can't ever get away from the conceptual issues. And this is such a vexed, defining empathy is a vexed issue in philosophy, right? Like, I know, one of my favorite Catholic philosophers, Edith Stein, wrote a dissertation on empathy. This is the sort of thing people spill a lot of ink over. So just to expect that we would find like the universal screener for empathy is a little naive.
Yeah. And even then, it's just like, even if you were to nail down a definition of empathy and you were to nail down a unified, standardized way of measuring it, empathy and empathy abilities are tied to cognition. They're tied to the way your brain works, and they change over time.
Yeah.
And so like sort of classically in autism research, they do studies of autistic children, and they find they lack theory of mind, or they have weaker theory of mind.
The Sally Ann kind of stuff, right?
Then their peers. They're much worse at that. But once you get to teenage and then adulthood, those differences largely disappear. And so it's like, okay, are they still autistic?
Right.
Like,
yeah,
if those definitions have
suspect
disappeared,
you could pass the Sally Ann test, John.
So fun story about that. I had a lab rat phase when I was in my 20s where I just signed up for every autism study that was looking for someone in my demographics, and they had me do that. Except they had me do it like fast twitch. So basically you got a half second to choose which one. And it was sitting in a fMRI machine and various different brain things while they poked and prodded me while I furiously pressed the left or right button.
Button matching.
It was the whole thing. Which does the box contain pencils or Smarties? Just on repeat. Or like, which ball did they put the hat into? Over and over. But
wow.
Yeah.
That's fun. So, I want to read your memoir for sure when you write it.
Yeah.
Well, back to diagnostic labels. So we're having a lot of fun right now, like ripping apart all of the problems with diagnostic labels and the heterogeneity. I want to give a little bit of the other side of the coin just for a moment. Like,
go for it.
When I looked into the literature on this, I was surprised, first of all, how little there is on like self-diagnosis, diagnoses as identities, and what literature there is, especially if it's more than a decade or two old, feels like it's talking about a completely different phenomenon, because there's a lot of stuff on like internalized stigma. Like that's a well kind of trod path taken mostly by sociologists rather than psychologists, where they have studied the ways that people have internalized sort of negative messages about diagnostic labels like addict or schizophrenic. But here, I think what sort of I'm interested in is in some ways almost the opposite of that. I suspect that part of the reason for movements like neurodiversity or like mad activism, or even the trends in self-diagnosis, are in large part the result of like destigmatization. And I think there's a salutary element to that. Like
Yeah.
there's a good thing about the fact that now people are not ashamed to say I'm autistic, or I have a diagnosis of like generalized anxiety disorder or borderline personality disorder. And they're so unashamed that they can even sort of find like social belonging and affiliation and like meet a lot of like basic psychological needs in the context of communities that are built around these diagnostic labels. So I would be remiss if I didn't say at least a little bit about that. Do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, so I'll just say, like, from a personal perspective, I am very glad I was diagnosed with autism. I am very glad I got the Asperger's label at the time that I did. Without that, I think my life would have been significantly worse. And I think I can say pretty definitively for the people in my research cohort, learning they had Asperger's or learning they had autism was a good, positive thing for them. And the biggest reason is because it gave, like, one of the experiences that is frequently described in late diagnosis is it gives you like a key to understanding your life, which is like there are lots of things with it. So one of the frequent things that happens when you get diagnosed as an adult is you look back on your life and you go, oh, was this autism? And you spend your whole life being like, I think I'm defective. I think I have something wrong with me. Like, I think I am a fundamentally broken person. And then someone comes along with a label and says, well, actually, there are a whole bunch of people like you, and they all do these same things. The reason you did this is not because you're a terrible person who is bad. The reason you did this is you have a thing wrong with your brain. And or there's something, you have a different brain is usually how they put it. They usually don't say something wrong with your brain in the neurodiversity movement, but they say there's something going on here that explains your past issues. And there is a lot of genuine help in that. If I had not received an autism diagnosis, I would be way harder on myself than I was. So I realized I was autistic at around age 12. I did not have language for it. I didn't know what to call it. But I had this fundamental epiphany that in the same way that some kids were bad at math, I was bad at understanding people. Like I realized, okay, there are people who for some reason can't do mental math very well. And that doesn't make any sense to me. How can you not do this? This is the most simple, intuitive process. And then I realized, wait a second, there are people who can do this for reading other people, and I don't have that ability. And that led me to be very harsh on myself, led me to not recognize that I was going through sensory overwhelm or like being sensory overloaded. And once I realized I had autism, I could pinpoint these things and go like, oh, I'm feeling this way. This is a way that autistic people typically feel. I should remove myself from the situation. Or like, I messed up a social interaction. This is a thing autistic people frequently do. This isn't something I should be ashamed of or something I should hate about myself. I just need to accept this is sort of a part of who I am. And there is a lot of genuine power and utility in being able to do that. I don't know if this is, I read a Substack about this, but there's the phenomena called the Rumpelstiltskin effect. And it's like based on the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, where you have this weird little guy who's gonna eat your firstborn or whatever, and on the only condition in which he won't eat your firstborn is if you can guess his name. And so you go through your life trying to guess the name of this thing trying to take your firstborn child, and then finally you figure out the name. And once you have that label, you go, okay, this is now a thing I can touch. This
There's
is no
power
longer
in names. The
yeah,
name makes it
exactly.
real.
Exactly. And this is true for physical illnesses, right? This is like, I went my whole life not realizing I had hypermobility. And then I realized, oh, I actually have hypermobility or something like this. And then now, because you have this tangible thing, you can deal with it.
This is true.
And
this is true for all identities. I mean, we're recording this in Pride Month. I mean, think about how powerful those names are for someone who discovers that, oh, there are gay people. Like,
yes.
this
Yeah.
is a thing. This is a thing. There's a word for these kinds of people. This is incredible. There's a liberatory aspect in naming things. By the way, the Rumpelstiltskin Substack, if it was the one that Awai Saftab wrote, then it's great, because everything he writes is great. Yeah, everything he writes, for whatever it's worth. Yes. I'm a nobody, but I would give everything he's ever written my imprimatur. If
I co-sign.
Cool. Yeah,
he's awesome. But yeah, so there is that like aspect of it, and it's one of the reasons I encourage people to go through with an autism diagnosis. Like, a lot of people ask me, is it worth it? And I normally say, I normally give a much more careful and revised answer, but it's usually like, it might not be worth you going through the actual diagnostic process, but it will, if you have it, it will be worth knowing that you have it, to sort through a lot of problems that are very difficult to sort through if you do not have this aspect of identity. That there is, like, there's a lot of real genuine value here, but on the flip side, I think you can take this too far, right? I think you can take this over identity with your mental disorder or with your neurodevelopmental disorder far past the point of usefulness, and you start going back into this identity that was the thing that was helping you is now the thing that is preventing you from moving past it. And so normally, like, what I see in the people that I talk to is they go through life not having a word for what they have. They get the word, they get the identity, they go full board. Hell yeah, I'm autistic. Yep. Fly the flag. This is great. And then after a while, they sort of calm down and they start going okay, well, what is this actually about? And I think, so you've done research into this.
Yeah, and I'll say a little bit about
wondering if you could talk about that.
I will. But your description of the evangelical zeal of a newly diagnosed autistic adult is not altogether different from what happens with religious conversions, right?
I have explicitly made that connection in several places that a lot of autistic people get new convert syndrome.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I have one of the Substack pieces I was actually working on today was about autism diagnosis as conversion.
Wow.
And going through the way that autistic people talk about conversion and the way that autistic people talk about learning that they have autism, and the way that there's a sort of really interesting parallel between religious conversion and diagnostic labels, and how we think about these things and everything that comes with them, and especially with masking discourse and born again evangelical discourse.
Oh, wow.
Of, I was wearing this, I was in a state of sin, I was wearing this false persona of who I was, and then I found Jesus, or I found my autism diagnosis, and now I have been set free. And like, at the beginning when I was conceptualizing this, I was like, I think I'm forcing this metaphor a little too hard. And then I started actually just looking at the words people were writing and going like, oh, I don't think I was forcing it hard enough. Like
Yeah,
there is
hallelujah.
a
I was
yeah,
lost
like
and now I'm found.
exactly, exactly. And my new identity is in Christ, and my new identity is in my autism, who I always knew I was all along. And I've come back to the flock, and not only that, but now I want other people to join me,
Yeah,
and I
well,
want to
what
tell
a trip it
everyone.
would be to have those two coincide at the same time, get diagnosed with autism and then convert to a new religion.
I have found those,
Yeah.
and a lot of them, a lot like so. I'm thinking of three particular people I interviewed who converted and then got diagnosed with autism shortly after conversion. And they interpret their diagnosis as God finally speaking to them after years of darkness, where they
Wow.
were asking, like, God, I want to be able to see me the way that you see me. And then they get an autism diagnosis and they go, oh, this was an answered prayer,
It's very
where, like,
beautiful. It's moving.
I saw God through learning that this is actually how God sees me and how God wants to see me and interact with me. And I find this endlessly fascinating as someone who is interested in both autism and Christianity,
Those
right?
are
This
those
is
are parts of your identity for sure. Yeah, those
right.
two. Yeah.
And so, like, this is there's a lot of very interesting territory here where, I mean, autism itself is not a religion, but religion itself isn't always just religion, right? There are
Yeah.
so many aspects
Yeah.
to it, and there are so many different things going on, that where I think there are many parallels between the autism diagnosis, and then also just looking at common Christian motifs of, the prodigal son and other sort of things like that get applied to autism, mostly because we are in a Western Christianized context, and people might not even, like, people aren't even Christian, and they are pulling on these, like, very evangelical-esque
It's like in the
conversion
background of
narratives.
our sort of
Yes.
cultural
Yeah.
unconscious, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like, is this actually, like, it's interesting how the tools, like the social technology of explaining religious conversion in secularized contexts, gets reappropriated to these other
That's a
fields.
lot of fun.
But
That's really interesting.
yeah,
That's really cool. I look
anyway.
forward to reading that. Yeah. Now,
Yes,
now, with
yes.
respect to identity and its discontents, I think I'll tell yeah, some research I've done and some other research that's out there suggests that there are some deleterious consequences for people who sort of over identify with diagnostic labels, as you've kind of intimated. I think, although I'm not familiar with any research to this that asks these questions, I suspect there are also problems with under identifying with labels or names or categories. But like, one of the questions that I'm sort of interested in is, like, what do we do, like, what's the right way to relate, what's like the healthy way to sort of relate to our sort of myriad of identities and sort of attempts to understand ourselves, because I don't think, like, we get to opt out of this. I think that's, like, really naive, the sort of, like, trad solution to say, oh, let's kind of just turn back the clock to the way things were in the Middle Ages, where you didn't have to ask and answer these kinds of introspective questions. They were just given to you. And one of the sort of, like, ironic little jabs I take in the article I wrote is, like, those people are, like, super attached to identity labels, like traditionalist or conservative or whatever. So I don't think there's any way out of the identity question. But I think I happen to sort of think so. When before we started recording, you were I won't say too much because I don't want to like spoil upcoming podcast episodes or Substack articles, but you were talking about we were talking about the true self. The true self. This is a kind of a concept that people this is we might call it a kind of fantasy people believe in, but I would like to think there's something there. I'd like to think that there is some, like, core of who we are, that we're not just like a bundle, like if you know, like David Hume's philosophy, we're not just kind of like a bundle of disconnected sensations and perceptions and memories, that we're sort of held together, and that there's this like innermost core of who we are that like God knows intimately. I'm thinking of something like in Revelation when we're told that there's like a true name written on a white stone that's known only to us or to God. I'm thinking of the Christian personalist tradition. And so, in addition to the question of what do we do with identity, I also have this question of like, how does identity relate to the self? Because there's always more to the self than any identity, right? Like, two of your identities I know right away are that you're a Christian, that you're autistic. You know, you've mentioned your background in military, you've mentioned your love of numbers and research. The list goes on and on. We could add social relations to that. We could add, nationality to that, political affiliation. But even if like we had a list of like John's top 500 identities, there would still be a remainder. There's still more to you than that list, no matter how long. It's never exhaustive. And I'm wondering if you have any like intuitions about that, or thoughts about that, even if they're critical. I welcome criticism.
Yeah. So I have a very complicated relationship to the self and to identity, mostly as a result of military service. Mostly because there are large parts of the self that I know I possess, which I would rather not. Right? I look at the core of who I am at my innermost being, and I do not see a thing I wish to be. Right?
Oh man.
There, well, like, so no one wants, so there's a lot of psychological research on killing, right? So
Yeah. Like
one of the
moral injury,
books,
right?
yes, and one of the books about the psychology of killing is called On Killing, and it's like a really popular one. Everyone in the military gets told to read it at some point, and it is about the psychological profile of what it takes to kill another man. And it talks about these findings about accuracy that soldiers have when they shoot at targets. And in the Second World War, you had soldiers who were shooting at circular targets. And they found that there was a low conversion rate to them shooting at a target versus them shooting at a human being. Because when you're there's like a psychological barrier that you have to overcome to actually will yourself to take the life of another human. And there's a certain portion of people who just don't have that, right? Who don't really have that psychological block to them. And like, what happens when you realize you're one of those people? Right? Like, does that make you feel better about yourself? And like
Wow.
your true self at your core, you realize is sort of, you read these stories about these sort of moral monsters, and you ask yourself, fundamentally, there but for the grace of God, what separates me from them is sort of circumstance,
Yeah, what
right?
does it say
And
about me that I might be capable of something like that?
yes, and what is it, uh, and just sort of over time, I remember the first time I watched someone get killed. I won't go into details, but like I wasn't, it wasn't on the battlefield or anything like that. Like I worked in military intelligence, so it's like, remember the first time you watched someone die in an FPV drone footage that you saw on Twitter from the Ukraine war. Picture that, right? You sort of watch a man's face go from fear to like shock and horror, and then you see a large black dot consume them on the screen. I remember when I first saw that, I was like, holy shit, I just watched a man die. And I sat with that for a while.
Yeah.
And then like 6 months later, I was eating a sandwich and being like,
Oh,
damn, I forgot to put my yogurt in the fridge. And now I don't know if it's safe to eat my yogurt. this is sad. And like
Like when you
while
were on the
watching
job, like
other,
on the
yeah,
job, like where you get to see this footage, like that was like
yes,
your concern. Like my
yes,
yogurt
and
might be
like
spoiled.
yes, there were like people dying, very serious situations, or like I was just about to go into, or I just got out of a briefing where I learned that 25 people were killed in this thing that was a result of military actions related to our partner forces that may have been preventable by something. And I'm like, why didn't I put my yogurt in the fridge? Now I can't eat my yogurt. I need to get my protein intake for the day because on my lifting schedule. And it's just like, in a sense, that is my innermost being. Right, that is a window into who I am to an extent. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about the self or the true self, sort of talk about it in a very self-congratulatory
Oh,
way.
there's empirical research on that. That
Like,
overwhelmingly people see their true selves as moral and good and
yes,
fair.
and I think that's a little diluted,
You,
right? Like people,
you're a bit of an Augustinian. I'm picking up.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, like people, this is a very common thread in autistic masking discourses. They're like, I realized that person who I was just masking my autism. And it's like, maybe that's actually who you are. Maybe who you are is the mask that you wear. Like, fundamentally, while there might be this inner self, that inner self has a desire to not project itself onto the world in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you should also like introspect on that.
Okay.
and,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and so like I think about like identity and the true self, and I think a lot of people just, they like to tell self-congratulatory narratives of what is going on. I see this so much in neurodiversity spaces where they're like, I'm not actually rude, I just tell people how it is, or
Yeah.
like I'm not
So
actually
there's something
inconsiderate.
protective about it, right?
Yeah. And it's like, well, no, dude, I think you actually are inconsiderate and rude because what you are doing is indistinguishable from what a rude and inconsiderate person would be doing in this scenario.
You know.
And so it's like your assessment of the true self also gets tied to autism identities. So to talk about unmasking autism, which is this book that I have this very weird relationship to in the sense that I hate it,
Yeah.
because reading it, like it was the first time I realized that like, oh, there are all sorts of autistic people out there who think about their autism and refuse to attribute negative characteristics to it, and refuse to think about autism in terms of having disorder and having issues. And to them, anything that is bad is not autism in the self, because the self is autistic and the self is good.
Yeah.
And so autism therefore must be good. And
Yeah.
it gets into this really weird thing where we're like, okay, your sort of self identity is tied up in feeling certain ways about yourself and this label that you've attached to it, which is autistic. The true self in these stories is an autistic self.
Well, so that's exactly what I would like to disambiguate. Is I think there's a difference between self and identity, and
Yeah.
the way I use those terms is, for me, it tracks, or it maps onto all of these nice distinctions made in this book called Against Identity by Alexander
Hell
Douglas,
yeah.
and also this really lovely distinction that William James made between the I and the me. But before I say more about that, first of all, I really appreciate you sharing those stories from your history. And one of the ways I'm like struck by your stories and your experiences is that these questions are never purely theoretical for anyone. And
Yeah,
like
exactly.
we all have our like psychological hangups and our fears and our anxieties and our moral regrets and failures and our experiences of guilt and shame, and like all of those things color, I think, everyone's approach to questions of self and identity. mine included. I have my own, hangups about the self. In fact, at some point, I'd like to talk to you about another thing I want to write about the liberatory aspects of identifying as a wretched sinner in the Christian tradition. This is something you don't often hear
Yes,
talked about. In fact, today, people often try to sanitize that devotional language. It's very common in the
I hate it.
Christian East, but I find it really cathartic to say, like, oh, yeah,
Same.
I'm a horrible person. Yeah.
Yes, I find it deeply cathartic. It
Cool.
is.
Awesome.
It
Cool.
is. I think one of the. It is the only emotional release that I get within Christian spiritual practice is this sort of hard language of repentance that you
Yeah.
get in the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah.
I remember talking to an Anglican priest, and I told him how much I loved the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and I remember him looking at me and being like, "Isn't it a little bit too penitent?" And I was like, "No, that's why it's good."
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like
Yeah.
the I by my fault, by my own fault, by my own most grievous fault is just like it hits something for me
Oh my
in a
gosh,
way
yeah,
that
I gotta put you on to
that
the Steeks of Repentance in the Byzantine tradition. They go even
oh,
harder. There's
nice.
prayers that are like, "Oh my God, I have never once in my life done anything virtuous." Like, at
Yeah.
least Judas felt bad. I can't even say that. It's unbelievable. And then at the end,
Hell
they
yeah.
all end with this kind of note of like, "And that doesn't matter. You're still."
Yes.
And because it wouldn't be any credit to you to save a righteous person, but if you save me, that's going to be a real demonstration of your power. Yeah, I really like
Yeah.
that.
And
I really like
in
that
in the
stuff.
Book of Common Prayer, it's but thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy is something that I anyway, I really like that. But like the to sort of tie back to what you were saying about the self and identity,
Yeah,
one of the reasons that I think over identifying with the autism label is that people are often encouraged to think of the self as though it is
that's
autistic
right.
and to not think of it as just an identity or an aspect of your identity, but to think of it as the true self.
Yeah,
And because they think of it as the true self, it gets tied up with all this other baggage, right? So a very common refrain you see in autism circles is they ask you, would you cure your autism?
mm,
And the answer, the sort of canonical answer is, I would not cure my own autism because who I am is autistic. And
right. I wouldn't
to
be me. I wouldn't be me
yes, I wouldn't be me.
yeah,
And if I cured my autism, it would be like I would lose myself and it would lose who I am. And I don't like that language.
I can.
I
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah,
I
yeah,
I think that is making just this like philosophical distinction about self and identity that is incorrect. Right? You are far more
yeah.
than
No,
this
that's
label.
exactly right. That's exactly right. Is that you
Yeah.
are, among other things, like the container of all these disparate parts of yourself and aspects of
Yeah.
of yourself, and one of those is autism, and that could even be a
Yeah.
very central one, but that's
And
not the
autism
whole of who you
touches
are.
a lot of the other
Yeah,
parts. Like, you're autistic and so your relationship to your wife will be flavored by autism.
that's
And
fair. Yeah,
so like there are these interactions and there are these ways that it seeps into things, but it isn't the be all and end all here. Like
no,
there is more to you. And I think a really frustrating part of talking about autism is on one side you have people who are like, well, you shouldn't label yourself, right? Don't give yourself these labels. I think that's deeply unhelpful advice and
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's
Same,
deeply
same,
counterproductive
same.
advice. But at the same time, on the other hand, you are your autism and your autism is inseparable from you. And it's like, what there is a sense in which you could say that in a reasonable way, but what it often turns into is this over identification with an aspect of your
Yeah,
identity to the point where, like, for me, I realized that this was holding me back in some pretty significant ways. When I was like, who I am is autistic, myself is autistic. When I started hitting autism related problems, I didn't realize this, but I was stopping myself from making genuine improvements to make my life less miserable because I didn't want to lose this core aspect of what I thought was myself. I didn't want to lose this identity
Yeah.
because I was convinced that this identity was me. And it's like, actually, you can just enjoy things.
Yeah,
Right? Like
well, let
you
me
don't
offer you
have to
this.
be
Yeah,
like this.
let me offer you this, kind of given the sort of theme of your whole podcast and your whole kind of intellectual enterprise. That I think there's a really nice parallel here with this Christian spiritual tradition of like self mortification. That, you know, unless a grain of wheat shall fall and die, right? That we all have to be willing to die to ourselves and to make of our lives and bodies a kind of sacrifice. And being willing to hold an identity a little more lightly, or to kind of distance oneself from it, or to give up aspects of it, I think is a kind of mortification, especially if until that time you were holding on to it so rigidly that it felt like losing that identity would mean losing a part of you. I mean, I feel that with so many aspects of my life that I'm sort of like terrified of giving them up. But ultimately, I think there's something morally and spiritually beneficial about being willing to kind of lay our identities kind of at the foot of the cross. I don't have this fully developed. This is very kind of inchoate, but do you see any of the kind of logic there?
Yes, yes, I absolutely do. And Romans 12 is the classic. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Like this, I think, is very important. And I find a lot of Paul's insistence that the old you has died and the new you is born with Christ. Like when you died with Christ. When you baptized, you were baptized with Christ. And I like a lot of the language that Paul uses specifically about identity not being rooted in you, but being rooted in Christ. And a lot of this is mostly because I'm a weird Girardian.
Well,
Fundamentally at
we
my
haven't
core.
even, but
We
yeah,
haven't even got there.
Gerard has plenty to say because, right, for Gerard, all of this identity stuff is the romantic lie, right?
Yes. And it's your identity is not just tied up in you, it's tied up of your perceptions of other people and how you think other people are perceiving you, and your desires are not necessarily your own, but the product of your interactions with other people. And the true overcoming of this mimetic bind is not to identify with yourself or with your own desires, which are formed by the other, but to identify outside of yourself with a non-mimetic
Yeah. Yeah.
being like Christ.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm a Gerardian too. We have that in common. I think that's
Hell
super
yeah.
cool that you're a Gerardian. I'm a Gerardian with qualifications because I think he like
Same.
I think he has this like, you know, idée fixe that he overplays his hand with constantly, but it's like a really fun one. So like, why wouldn't you? But
Yeah. Yeah. I think he has hammer nail syndrome for sure.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I think things start to break down at like
yeah,
once you start getting larger groups, I think this has less play. And
uh-huh.
a lot of Girardians try to like apply Girard's analysis to like
It's like everything.
large
Yeah.
nation states, and it's like, guys, I don't
Well,
think this
there,
applies at that
I
level.
think they have a point. I think they have a point there. I mean, look, the sort of foreign policy today is all about like who can sort of play the victim better.
Yeah, I
Russia
mean,
is like, oh, we're Ukraine has been oppressing us, and Ukraine is like, no, Russia invaded us. It's like,
so I think you can draw parallels there, but they start to break down significantly
no, you're right.
more
Yeah,
at that sort of macro layer. And I think most of what Girard says can be applied at these different layers of abstraction, but they work way better at
that's
sort
what I
of
love.
lower layers of abstraction
Yeah, that's right.
than they do at these higher layers. But
Yeah, but
yeah,
all that to say, I think we're not an onion. I think, if you peel away autism and, first generation American and whatever, whatever else, you might want to be, Detroit Lions fan, whatever. If you peel everything away, the answer is like, is there something underneath, or is there nothing? And I really, you have a like a profile, like avatar of Simone Weil. Like, I really don't like her level of self abnegation. Like, I think there is something underneath these layers of identity. That something is good. That something is known intimately by God. And the danger is precisely when we equate that deeper, transcendent innermost self with any of these finite contingent identities. That's the danger, is when we try to make a diagnostic label or a nationality or a social or political affiliation or whatever equal to that innermost self that is unable to be exhausted by any label or term.
Yeah, I still don't know what to think about that, right? I go back and forth on this, and if you find me like next week, I'd probably say something completely different than what I'd say now, but I go like, maybe, right? Maybe there is that thing at the end that when, you peel back all the layers of the onion and you get something in the core, like the jawbreaker. There is a gummy center to all the candy layers on it that is something other than that. But at the same time, I try to conceptualize what that would be, and I just draw blanks.
Yeah, me too.
Like
That's part of my hang
yeah,
up with all of this, is that, like, we can only be apophatic about it. Like, we can only say what
yes,
it's not, but we can't quite say what it is. And there's something deeply frustrating about that for me, because I would like to know, like every other modern person, I would like to know who I am, and I'd
yeah.
like to know, like, who I'm going to be in the eschaton. Um, but there's precious little that God tells us about that, in the scriptures. And yeah, and there's little that we can know about that philosophically, and so I find that frustrating.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you there. And like I think about what is a version of me going to look like in this sort of perfected state where all of these potentialities that I have that are unrealized will finally become realized. What even is that? What and the answer that I come to is I just have no idea. Right? It is a black box, and whenever you have those, you sort of need to ask yourself, well, is there, you're searching around a dark room with a flashlight, is there actually a box inside that room and you just haven't found it yet, or are you just in a dark room with a flashlight, type of thing,
Well, if you find it,
uh,
would you let me know if you find the answer to these
yes.
questions? All right, send me a DM if you, you know.
I will. Yeah.
If any of your
um
listeners know the answer to the deepest sort of questions that humans have asked themselves throughout history, please.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, don't invite them. They'll send you long emails
Oh, hell
about
yeah,
like
that'd be cool.
they'll send you long emails about the theology of BDSM. You don't want that.
I mean,
I'm joking. That has happened 3 times to me so far.
as long as they don't
Um,
over-identify with that.
yeah, I guess.
Okay. On that note.
Yeah. On that note, it was really good having you. We need to have you back to talk about a lot of other stuff
Yeah.
that have
Thanks.
just
I'd love.
popped up in this. This was really great, but there is sort of an inexhaustible range of topics that I would like to discuss with
Yeah.
you that have
Likewise.
spawned from this. So, if the good people of this podcast would like to find you or any of your work, where would they find it?
Yeah. Twitter and Substack. SimonSimplicio.substack.com. Is that how Substack works? It's like your username.substack.com. And then
I'll link it.
the piece is called Finite and Eternal Selves. Some thoughts about identity. And I will send you, John, everything I spoke of in this podcast, so you can link books and articles for all of your dedicated
Hell
autodidactic
yeah.
listeners.
Hell yeah. Will do. All right. Good talking to you. My name is John. You can find me Christianity on the Spectrum at gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Christianity On. You can find me on Substack at Christianity On, or my blog is Dispatches from the Autism Wars. I am also on Blue Sky. You can find me Christianity on .bluesky.social there. And this podcast is raising funds for the Against Malaria Foundation. At the time of recording, we are at like $26,000 raised, which is wild that anyone is paying attention to this podcast and donating. But I am super appreciative of everyone who does. It genuinely keeps me going. It genuinely keeps me making me want to make these podcasts. When I see those donations, I am like, this is having a meaningful, good impact on the world. It is a tangible way that I can measure people's appreciation, and it goes towards a very good cause, which is saving lives. The Against Malaria Foundation does save lives very effectively, dollar for dollar. So if you have the ability and you like this podcast, or you like any of my work and you would like to support it, please donate through that link, which I will put in the description. All right. See y'all later.